Welcome to Discovering. Spend any time in the woods and you know there's a lot more here than meets the eye. Sometimes you just gotta take a closer look.
Lichens are among our best biological indicators. They tell you a lot about the health of the forest.
Tonight we'll take a closer look at lichens. Stick around, it's Monday night and time for Discovering.
The secret streams that flow beneath the cliffs of colored stone. Forest thick and healthy with birch and pine and oak. Surrounded by the greatest lakes this world has ever known. The black bear's awesome presence as he roams the hills and fields. Call of the timber wolf, the loon's lonesome trill. The eagle soaring high above, the trout lies deep and still. These are what I treasure, the only way I measure feelings that I have for this fine land. There is so much to discover when you're a long-time lover of northern Michigan.
They're all around us. We've seen them, but maybe never really taken a close look. A closer look. Even closer. What are they and what can they tell us about the health of our forest and our air? I met up with ecologist Ryne Rutherford and found out there's a lot more to lichens than meets the eye.
So we're going to look at some lichens today. Lichens are a conglomerate organism that contain a fungus, an algae, and a cyanobacteria all within the same organism. So what we're looking at right here is dragonfoot lichen, also known as Labaria pulmonaria. It's one of our most special lichens in the UP. We have probably over 800 different species, and this is certainly one of our showiest. So you can see it's really adapted at catching rainfall, snowfall, and then what it's going to do is it's going to just kind of slowly melt, and this allows the lichen to be metabolically active. Even when it's a little bit below freezing outside, the lichen can actually be active during these temperatures. A few really amazing things about this one in particular is since it does have cyanobacteria, it can take nitrogen out of the air and literally fertilize the forest. About half the nitrogen from the forest is coming from this one lichen, and this is a related one here. This one's also mostly in older forests, old growth, but also some well-managed second growth they can persist in. A lot of the time it's dormant. What you see right here, it's nice and bright green. We have a little bit of snowmelt going on, which allows it to kind of spring to life here. So even though it's a little bit below freezing, it's active right now, and the fact that there's no leaves on the trees allows the sunlight to filter down here and allows the lichens to thrive, even though we might consider, this kind of the off season or the dormant season for most other life forms. But it's actually a great time for lichens. If you look closer on here, you have different kinds of lichens too. So we have some green shield lichen here. This one right here is a dust lichen. So it's very different ecologically. This lungwort is adapted to pick up rain, snowmelt, so I can spray it, and it's gonna immediately, you can even see it turn greener as I do that in just a few seconds. It's taken up that moisture, and it allows it to be metabolically active. So this part of the tree is gonna get all of the runoff. So this is a much moister habitat than the back side of the tree here. So if we look at this side of the maple, you can see that this is actually covered with lichens here too. These little white dots right here. All of these are little crustose lichens. This is a totally different habitat than the other side and allows different lichen species to occur here. So on one tree like this, you might have 20 or more different kinds of lichens right here. This one right here, this is a stubble lichen. And a lot of these are only in really old forests, so they're really good lichens to monitor. They tell you a lot about the health of the forest. Yeah, so lichens are among our best biological indicators. They tell you a lot about a particular site's temperature, humidity, the chemistry of a particular spot where they're at, and are among the best thing for foresters to monitor. I mean, they tell you an awful lot if a forest is well managed. So in general, where you have abundant lichens is where you have your most pristine environments, and the fact that we have so many in the EP is really a testament to simply how unspoiled this region still is. So this lichen right here, this lungwort lichen, used to occur throughout southern Michigan, southern Wisconsin since the Industrial Revolution. It's pretty much been totally extirpated. I mean, just from deteriorating air quality, but it still occurs in abundance here. This same lichen also occurred throughout much of Europe too before the Industrial Revolution, but now it's extremely rare there as well. So we're really lucky to have it. It tells us so much about our air. I mean, you really can't see air, so things like lichens tell us what's in the air without even being able to really see it or test it in other ways. All right, so here we have some rock lichens, very different from the tree lichens. This kind here is called rock shield. The genus begins with an Xanthoparmelia, and it's pretty much only on rock. There's several different species, and this one prefers rock that's open to the full sun. So we have a nice south-facing opening here along the river, so it's really good habitat for that one too. If you look closer, there's a few smaller ones here. This is a kind of map lichen, a rhizocarpon. You might look at this and easily dismiss it. It's not very conspicuous. The really amazing thing about it is simply how long these guys can live. So there's one species up on the Arctic called the yellow map lichen that's been found to live over 8,000 years. They grow just fractions of a millimeter per year. And a lot of the lichen is actually inside of the rock. So the little fungal hyphae on the bottom of the lichen can penetrate between the crystals and the rocks several millimeters deep. They've been found up to 16 millimeters deep, so there's really no distinguishing this lichen from the rock. And lichens have an amazing chemistry too. They produce acids that help break down the substrate to provide nutrients for the lichen. With the Xanthoparmelia here, they get this color from a kind of acid called ooznic acid, and it protects it from ultraviolet light. So you kind of see this color lichen, you can pretty well assume that it's got ooznic acid in there. And particular lichens that are exposed to full sunlight will produce that particular kind of acid. So when you look at rocks covered in lichens, what's really amazing is you have a whole bunch of different habitats, even on the same rock. So the top versus the sides, and even underneath. This is one of the types of gold dust lichen. This one is only underneath overhangs that gets no direct influence from rain. So it's only on slopes that are greater than 90 degrees, and it can only absorb water through humid air. If I spray water on it, it'll just kind of beat up and eventually fall off. It can only get water through humidity, through really humid air, and that's all the moisture that it needs is just from the air. Lichens on conifers like this spruce here are very different than those on hardwoods. So with conifers, you often have rainfall towards the outer edge. So that's where a lot of the lichens are, particularly on dead branches. This is oak moss lichen. Evernia mesomorpha, it's really abundant on conifers. It's really spongy. It also has that same lime green color. So it also has ooznic acid in it. So this is an Usnea lichen here. This particular one prefers to grow on conifers, but there's a few dozen species in the country, and it's of prominent wildlife importance too. Birds will use it for nesting, particularly northern parulas. A pretty important one too in parts of the world, so it's been used for thousands of years, and it's said to have all kinds of medicinal properties, but it's mostly used as an antibiotic. It's a sign of really high moisture, humid environments. So here in the northern UP, you see it along river courses like the Sturgeon River right here. It's really abundant. If you look at the structure, it has a central cord and branches that kind of radiate out from that. This is called curly horsetail, Equisetum scarpoides. You usually see it growing along rivers on evergreen, but really interesting. The stems actually contain glass. I mean, you can even file your finger with it. It's easier with the larger ones, but even a small one like that is pretty neat. So you get different kinds of lichens growing on different kinds of trees. So conifers and hardwoods are different kinds, but even within those groups, you have different species. So on this cedar, we have surprise lichen here, Basidia shingweldsii, that pretty much only grows on cedars, at least in this region. And it's on this one we can see the main reproductive structure, which are these black dots here. They're called apothecia, and that's where the spores are produced. So these produce fungal spores that'll be released out into the atmosphere, and if they land on the right algae, they can form a new lichen. So that's one mode that they can reproduce. So some lichens are pretty generalized in their preferences. So what we have here is green shield lichen, and this will grow on conifers, hardwood, rock. It's really generalized in its preferences, and also has a pretty set growth rate. So it'll grow about 5 millimeters per year. So a patch like this, it might be a decade or more old, but you can age the lichen by the size of the patch. It's your most common green lichen that we have on trees. So what we have here are one of the jelly lichens. So I mentioned that lichens can form a bond between a fungus and an algae, but also fungus and a cyanobacteria. So this is one that has cyanobacteria in it. And you can tell because of the darker color. So other lichens, they might be grayish or greenish or orange, but this has a really dark, almost black color. And that's from the cyanobacteria. And the species of cyanobacteria in here it's very moisture loving, so you tend to only find these jelly lichens in places that are really, really moist, like right next to this waterfall. So this one right here is called sea storm lichen, and it's called that because the edges almost look like waves. They look like breaking waves. And it's on really old trees, but also shaded rock walls, just like this one here. As you can see, the edges, they kind of have this powdery stuff on the edge that are called Ceridia that can break off or be wiped off and then end up growing into a new lichen, but it's a really spectacular one that you find growing on shaded rock walls. This one's Citralia olivatorum. So this is kind of a rare old growth forest specialist too. This is called tree flute lichen, Menigazia, and if you look at it really closely, you can see it's got little pores on it, just like the holes on a flute. Thus its name. It's really a beautiful lichen that prefers very shaded, humid environments. So this one here it's pretty common. It's called bitter wart lichen, and it's really strange among lichens in that it actually has a taste. And it's got a really bitter taste to it. It's kind of a pleasant bitter. It's not bad, but that's a kind of an odd way to identify that lichen. So this is a kind of moss here. It's called Hylocomnium splendens, or stair-step moss. So if you look at it, you can see it sends out these little ledges of foliage, and every year it'll send out a new ledge. So this would have been from last year, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one's probably about 5 or 6 years old, just this little strand, and it can form these mats here on the floor of the forest, particularly under conifers and boreal forests. And this is also one that's able to fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere and deliver it to the soil. So this is a type of pelt lichen here, the genus Peltigera. You can see that it's got this very brownish color. This is from the cyanobacteria that lives inside of it. And what's really neat about it is the underside has these little structures. They're called rhizines. They're root-like structures that they kind of look like little brooms, and they'll grab onto the substrate. So in this case, it's grabbing onto the moss, it's grabbing onto the rock, and allows it to kind of cover the substrate. And this is another one that's really abundant in really humid microclimates. If you look at that lime green lichen, that's a kind of lichen called rock ramellina. It's a little bushy lichen that pretty much only grows on very dry rock faces. And it can cover some pretty large expanses of rock, and it occurs where there's very little moisture. So this is the Sturgeon River quartzite here. It's between 2.2 and 2.3 billion years old, ancient quartzite. And what we have here is really large rock crystals, and one lichen that prefers that habitat is this lichen here, just spectacular. It's called moonglow lichen, Dimolina oriana. And in my lichen study, I found this is the only one that prefers very large crystal size. And on these quartzite outcrops, it's by far the dominant lichen. So this is a type of crustose lichen, meaning that the lower part of it is embedded into the substrate. So there's parts of this lichen that extend down into that rock, likely several millimeters in really hard quartzite, one of our hardest rocks, which is really pretty amazing. And patches like this are going to be growing at just fractions of a millimeter per year. So these are going to be decades, if not centuries old, some of these individual patches of lichens on this quartzite. The halo that you see around it's the actual growing part. So it's done growing in the middle. It's growing towards the outside. Like I said, just fractions of a millimeter per year, really slow growth rate. So here's a really nice selection of ground lichens here. So these are really ecologically important. About 8% of the Earth's surface is covered with ground lichens, and actually a few of these kinds here are some of our dominant ones. This gray one here, this is called the gray reindeer lichen, and this is common in sterile openings, rocky, sandy openings throughout the UP with abundant sunlight. But this is also really abundant up on the Arctic tundra. This makes up about 90% of the diet of caribou up on the Arctic. Ground lichens are really important for wildlife here too. We have deer that eat lichens. The least chipmunk, our smallest chipmunk species, eats lichen, flying squirrels, and of course a lot of birds will use them for nesting too. And these are also really ecologically important too because they're able to keep moisture down into the soil. So they form a nice crust over the surface and they can dry out. But even if they're dry, you can look underneath and that soil is still going to be nice and moist. So what we're seeing is this lichen ground cover community is insulating that soil layer. And this also allows other tree species and shrubs to grow here too. So it stabilizes the soil, it allows soil to develop, and then you get things like trees, like this Juneberry tree growing here. We got a few blueberry bushes, a red pine, a white pine, and these lichens are able to kind of start that process, the process referred to as succession, by which you get an open area without any vegetation slowly gets colonized, and the lichens play a really important role in that process. This is called toadskin lichen right here, Lasallia papulosa. It's called that because the thallus has a whole bunch of little bumps on it, just like a toad skin. And unlike a lot of the other lichens on the rocks, it doesn't get water from runoff, it gets water directly from rain. So you spray it, you see that it immediately changes color. So as I spray it, that outer layer of fungus becomes translucent, allowing that inner algal layer to be able to get exposure to the sunlight, to photosynthesize and produce sugars for the lichen to consume. So now this part's metabolically active in just a second. I mean, just spraying a little bit of water on it is all that takes. So this is a rock tripe lichen. It's called Umbilicaria mammulata, and this rock wall is just covered with it. So this lichen is adapted at picking up runoff that's coming over the surface of the rock, and it has this rather felty black lower cortex, and it's kind of like a sponge. It wicks up that moisture as it comes off the surface of the rock. And this lichen is actually edible. During the Revolutionary War, George Washington fed his troops at Valley Forge and allowed them to survive the winter there. They call these umbilicate lichens because they have an umbilical cord-like structure that allows them to stay hardly fastened to the rock. It's also our largest lichen. So these patches, you know, you might have a few here, 4 or 5 inches. There's some in the area that are a foot across or more, just a single lichen. So you often might think of lichens as something really small and hard to see. This is one that's quite obvious and quite showy if you're in the right spot. This is an example of a dry rock face community. So this is mostly covered with rock Ramalina intermedia. This little bushy one, this little lime green bushy one is very abundant here, right there. There's also a rare fern here called the fragrant cliff fern, Dropterus fragrans, and its dead fronds are right here. This is listed as special concern in Michigan, and it actually does have a nice fragrant smell to it. It's really easy to identify based on that, and it's pretty much only on dry cliff faces that are very low in nutrients, so quartzite or granite, volcanic rocks sometimes. But it's a pretty special fern indeed. Yeah, this is a fern that grows all the way up into the Arctic Circle too on acidic rock outcrops. It's right at the southern limit of its range here. It doesn't go much further south than this, and it's pretty neat when you find it. And we're on a north-facing slope here, so this is a site that doesn't get any direct sunlight, so this is a dry, cool microclimate that we're in. This differs from the cliffs that have a lot of rock tripe on them because this one does not get a lot of runoff from rainwater and groundwater. This stays pretty dry, so it's a different humidity. A lot of the moisture here comes in the form of humidity. So this canyon stays pretty humid. These lichens can persist. So as my mentor has written, Erwin Brodo, lichens are the essence of wildness. To find them in abundance is to find a corner of the universe that's still pure and unspoiled. And I think that's exactly what we have here in the UP. We just have amazing lichen diversity. And it's just a testament to how wonderful the UP still is here to have all this. Been wiped out from so much of the planet. It's easy to take it for granted because, you know, they're small and they're inconspicuous, but when you really learn about them, you learn to appreciate them and really learn to appreciate just how unique our little corner of the world is. Well, I hope we've all enjoyed learning about lichens and now are able to see your environment in a little bit different way. It's just amazing how much diversity there is around us, particularly here in the UP when you have rock outcrops and streams and old growth forests and conifer swamps and just so many different amazing habitats. And every one offers something a little bit different if you're willing to take a closer look at it. So thanks for tagging along today, and I hope you've learned something interesting.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next week right here on Upper Michigan's very own Discovering.